said if we fall, others are rising. From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow. Then Vincent Lingiari boarded an airplane.
The Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture is hosted each year by the Office of the Pro Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Leadership at Charles Darwin University and the Australian Centre for Indigenous Knowledges and Education, or the ACICI. And this lecture honours a great Australian and his role in a crucial episode of this nation's history. On 23rd of August 1966, Vincent Lingiari led members of the Gurindji tribe and others off Wave Hill Station, owned by the British-owned and operated Vesties Group. What was apparently an industrial dispute over appalling work and living conditions revealed itself as a demand by the Gurindji people for the return of their traditional lands. It was a demand that was to spread throughout Aboriginal Australia and was the beginning of a struggle by Aboriginal people nationally that continues to this very day. So the importance of the Wave Hill strike to the broader Aboriginal struggle for land rights cannot be overstated. Wave Hill veteran Billy Bunter Jumpa reminds us of the legacy of Wave Hill in his profound and moving words, and I quote, "It is the same thing with them as it was with us. It's the true living country for the old people and their children and grandchildren to come. The country is part of their life, and their life is part of the country," end of quote. Billy Bunter was only 16 when Vincent Lingiari led his people off Wave Hill on a 25-kilometre walk to camp away from Vesties Station. Jumpa was a stockman at the Cattle Creek outstation, which was part of Wave Hill, and I quote, "We were treated just like dogs. We were lucky to get paid the 50 quid a month we were due, and we lived in humpies. You had to crawl in and out on your knees. There was no running water. The food was bad, just flour, tea, sugar and bits of beef, like the head or feet of a bullock. The Vesties mob were hard men. They didn't care about blackfellas. Old Vincent came back from hospital in Darwin one day, and he'd decided that he would pull us out. He pulled everyone out Tuesday, and we walked with the kids and our swags to the Victoria River, where we camped until after Christmas. After we'd been there a couple of days, the Vesties mob came out, and they said they would get us 2 killers of slaughtered beasts and raise our wages if we came back, but old Vincent said, we're stopping here. Then in early 1967, we walked to our new promised land, we call it Dagaragu, or Waddy Creek in brackets, back to our sacred places in our country and our new homeland," end of quote. The Gurindji were not seeking wages, they were fighting to win their land back and refused to work even when Vesties offered to pay some, inverted commas, money wages. Vincent Lingiari told Lord Vestie, I quote, "You can keep your gold, we just want our land back," end of quote. It was a strike that was to last 7 years, despite national demonstrations, arrests and supporters of the Gurindji, including trade unions, churches and student groups. However, in the pre-Whitlam era, the Gurindji pleas fell on deaf ears, and it was only in 1969 that a proposal went to the then federal coalition government to grant 8 square kilometres to the Gurindji without discussion. Despite enormous pressure from pastoralists and government, the Gurindji people, the community and a nation of supporters held firm. Bill Jeffries, a welfare worker with the Northern Territory Administration at the time, was threatened with the sack for giving assistance to the strikers camped at Dagaragu. The Gurindji, as well as Aboriginal Union activist Dexter Daniels, were threatened with rifles and shotguns, and at one stage the strikers were near starvation, but the Gurindji never returned. It was not until 1975 that then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam gave the Gurindji back some of their lands. His symbolic and enduring pouring of the soil into the hands of Vincent Lingiari has been repeated by subsequent governments and ministers in returning traditional lands back to their rightful owners. As a focal point in Australian history, the Wave Hill strike has its share of white and black veterans, including the likes of waterside worker, the late Brian Manning, who trucked in the first food supplies to the strikers, and the late Frank Hardy, an author who did more than most to publicise the plight of the Gurindji. The Wave Hill walkout was a focal point which has spread far beyond that moment and unified many confronted by both the labour movement and the fight for both land rights and human rights. Sadly, Lingiari died on the 21st of January 1988, just a few days short of the 200th anniversary of white settlement on his traditional lands. He took enormous pride in the achievements of his people and attended every annual reenactment of the walk-off, and he passed as a proud and dignified man who led the Gurindji, Naraman, Millenara, Walpuri and Mudbara on strike 41 years ago. We commemorate here tonight the triumph of Indigenous rights in the face of diversity and the triumph of justice over commerce and colonial power. I now ask our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Simon Maddox, to introduce our distinguished speaker for tonight's Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture.
Thanks very much, Professor Larkin, Sir Tipene and Lady O'Regan, Mrs Faye Miller, Mayor of Catherine Town Council, Senator Nova Peris, the Honourable Warren Snowden, MP, Member for Lingiari, the Honourable Darryl Manzi. Special welcome to the Gurindji Elders and to members of the Manning family, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Richard, I want to start by thanking you for welcome to country and adding my acknowledgement to the Larrakia people and their elders past and present on whose traditional lands this event takes place. It is my very great pleasure this evening to introduce our most distinguished speaker, Sir Tipene O'Regan. The Wave Hill Station walk-off by the Gurindji people and other groups was a catalyst for the beginnings of the Aboriginal land right movement in Australia, as Professor Larkin has already articulated. But Australia's Indigenous people are not alone in their history of struggle for land rights. Around the world, Indigenous people have fought, and indeed still fight, to reclaim their land and the culture, language and heritage that is inextricably linked to it. Tonight we are honoured to have with us, as guest lecturer, Sir Tipene O'Regan, an eminent academic and Maori leader who has a long history of involvement in land rights in New Zealand. As a komatua, a noted elder of New Zealand's South Island Ntahu tribe, Sir Tipene has guided his people to successful land and fisheries claims from 1985 to 1998, culminating in the Treaty of Settlements in 1998. From 1986 to 1992, he was involved in the treaty fisheries claims, and he designed their settlements in 1989 and 1992. As well as being a Maori leader, Sir Tipene has had an outstanding academic career and a life of public service. A former co-chair of New Zealand's Constitutional Advisory Panel, a former Assistant Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canterbury, Sir Tipene also chairs the Centre for Maori Research Excellence at the University of Auckland and is a former Assistant Vice-Chancellor Maori at the University of Canterbury. Sir Tipene is a Distinguished Fellow of the Institute of Directors and a Fellow of the University of Auckland. He holds 3 honorary degrees, a Doctor of Letters from the University of Canterbury and 2 Doctorates of Commerce from Lincoln University and from the Victoria University of Wellington, respectively. He has also held a number of long-term appointments in the New Zealand heritage sector, retiring after 29 years as member of the New Zealand Geographic Board. Sir Tipene's academic interests lie in traditional Maori, treaty and wider Pacific history, and comparative culture contact experience. He has written and lectured on the evolution of the Maori intergenerational economy and on the development of Indigenous governance. Sir Tipene's lecture tonight is on the economics of Indigenous survival, the issues, challenges and opportunities inherent in Indigenous economic development and the cultural redevelopment of Indigenous minorities. It is indeed an honour to have such an esteemed scholar and leader with us here at Charles Darwin University, a man whose efforts are shaping the future of the Maori people in New Zealand, just as Vincent Lingiari's did for Australian Indigenous people almost 50 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming to deliver the 14th Vincent Lingiari Memorial Lecture, Sir Tipene O'Regan.
Tuatahi, kai te mihi atu kia koutou te mana whenua o Larrakia. Tēnei te mihi nui o ka mauka auraki ka moku katoa o te waipaunamu o Aotearoa, hei mihi atu ki a koe. Rere atu. Aku mihi anō ki o koutou tūpuna, ki o koutou mati. Me tō kōrero manaki anō hoki tēnā koutou. Ko huri anō ki te iwi o Gurindji. Me ka tēni mahara o katoa au mua. Vincent Lingiari. Eddie Mabo anō hoki. Kumunje, Charlie Perkins anō hoki. Aku hoa o ka mahi kākari o mua ki te aroaro o te karauna. Moene mahara tēnā koutou. I have thanked Richard for the dignity of his welcome and the dignity of my mother's tongue. I also pay tribute tonight to some of your warriors of my own generation with whom I have had some association and whose work has powerfully impacted the rights of Indigenous cultures, not just in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but around the world. And I thank you for your welcomes, Vice Chancellor, and I thank you very much for the invitation of the University. Mō tātou mō ka uri I muri ake nei. For us and our children after us. In our history, this aspiration was connected to our 7-generation struggle with the Crown in New Zealand for the Ngāi Tahu claims. I re-emphasise litigation, any litigation that runs for 7 generations develops a history and a momentum of its own. And it's the effect of that to some degree that I wish to refer to this evening. But this aspiration, this motto for us and our children after us, it manifested our purpose. It told us of why we were engaged. This motto of ours is still aspirational. It still has that nice pious ring to it. And it decorates almost everything we undertake. From cultural festivals to exhibitions, to tribal superannuation savings schemes. It's all over our tribal and subsidiary company websites. But now we have settled our claims and made peace with the state. What is that aspiration? What is our new purpose? What does the motto mean now? What was that 7 generations all about? In other words, the dog has chased the car, barking all the way down the road, but now it's caught it. And what does it do with it? I propose this evening to bring to your attention the very large issue, well, to me it's large anyhow, it's a substantial issue, of Indigenous governance, of Indigenous capital for Indigenous purposes. Now, general governance principles proceed from and sit within a broader mesh of cultural ethics. In our kind of national economies, Australia and New Zealand's and national cultures, they've been evolved to manage the Western model of liberal capitalism, that Indigenous minorities with which I'm acquainted are surrounded. I will postulate that such governance models are inappropriate for the distinctive needs and the aspirations of Indigenous minorities, and that those cultures need, if they are to maintain and control their own cultural heritage and integrity, to evolve their own ethic of Indigenous governance. I don't have a prescription for that new model, but I accept that it will almost certainly incorporate, you might say by reverse colonisation, I don't call it cultural adaptation anymore, I talk about reversing the colonising process by taking bits of it for our own ends. You might think it's reverse colonisation, anyhow, I do. A range of concepts and ideas taken from the power cultures themselves. Rather than prescribe, I will urge the advancing of a conversation aimed at evolving models of the ethic I've referred to above, but in which the Indigenous minorities are themselves the autonomous managers of their own futures. I will assert that such an ethic of Indigenous governance needs to be congruent with the aims and aspirations of the culture to which it belongs, and also to be directed ultimately to the survival and continuing evolution of that culture. I want to emphasise that I'm not talking about freezing culture in some museum artefactual space. All cultures, if they are to survive, must continue to evolve and to grow, but that the structure of that process is for that culture to determine, for that culture to decide for itself, rather than have it prescribed by others. I make no apology for viewing the matters I propose to discuss with you through the prism of my own Ngāi Tahu tribal identity and experience. You'll have to take my word for it, though, that the issues I'm attempting to raise confront in various forms just about every Indigenous minority I either have experience or knowledge of. Other Maori tribes in New Zealand, Native Americans in the USA, or First Nation groups in Canada. They have a resonance too with our friends the Sami of Norway and the Inuit peoples in Scandinavia and Northern Europe. But I want this evening first to tell you something of this tribe from which I descend through my Ngāi Tahu mother, and to draw from our experience some sense of the challenge we face in the evolution of a culturally relevant model of governance, as we assume command of our own future on the back of our own capital, and for which we are now responsible both to protect and to grow. As a consequence of settling our historic claim against the state, we have deprived ourselves of the consolations of grievance. But how do we rid ourselves of its smell? Who is there now to blame? We've got this famous cartoon in New Zealand of a bunch of our ancestors standing on the beach looking at these guys coming ashore from a sailing boat. They say, "Thank God, at last we've got someone to blame." And we are, after all, very much like most citizens in most liberal democracies. We know in fine detail as a people what we don't want and what we don't want to be. We're far less clear on what we do want to be and how we want to be. Until we've come to terms with the question of what we want to be as a people, there is no horizon of purpose, no need for any strategic direction beyond making cash and distributing it more or less efficiently and more or less equitably. But if that's all the membership in an Indigenous culture amounts to, why bother? Why bother about having an identity and a future if all you're going to do is make money and spin it round? Why do you exist as a people? First, though, I attempt the question, before I attempt the big questions, I need to introduce this tribal people who hold the traditional authority, or mana whenua, in Maori terms, over the greater part of Te Waiponamu, the South Island of New Zealand. Our area, as you see on the green part of the map above you, is an enormous area. Bear in mind, a lot of it's not much use for growing kumara or sweet potato because it's all mountains and snow. You can fly in direct from Darwin to, from Sydney or Melbourne to Queenstown and go skiing, but the bulk of it is mountains and snow. but it's a huge territory. And the red part at the top of the map is not us, that's the remnants of the invaders. We got them out of the rest of the green part, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We've now made peace with them, they're our friends now. But my mother's people then are of these, and my own marae, my own area, is right at the very, very south of that map, at the southern end of Highway 1. We say it's the beginning of Highway 1. The North Islanders say it's the end of it. We are formed of three broad streams of descent, the most ancient arriving in the north of the South Island, that's the yellow line, in very ancient times and a very remote past, and the other two migrating southwards from the east coast of the North Island in the second quarter of the 17th century. From our traditional histories, we know that by the late 18th century, these three originating streams of descent had melded into a relatively cohesive single identity as a people calling itself Ngāi Tahu. I'm deliberate in my choice of the expression relatively cohesive. I choose it because I should not like you to think that the process of establishing relative cohesion over the 17th and 18th centuries would meet with the approval of today's Human Rights Commission or even our current community consultation standards. On the contrary, the traditional story offers us a richly textured history of retributive warfare between the groups that were to become Ngāi Tahu. Warfare over claims to resources of land and coast, over women, over issues of mana, or prestige and authority and status, all the myriad causes that people everywhere have ever gone to war about. Our vast tribal territory was matched with a small population of about 3,000 people living in far-flung, largely coastal settlements. This diverse collection of closely related but vigorously autonomous communities, spaced out, travelled and communicated incessantly. They were all connected by a reinforced mesh of whakapapa, that's genealogy or kinship, constantly being refreshed by intermarriage. The seasonal availability of resources dominated everything, including warfare. Seasonality controlled the east-west trade in Pounamu, the nephrite jade, in Taramea, the perfumes, in Tikumu, the scented grasses, and a huge inventory of preserved foods. Seasonality controlled the whole annual intra-group exploitation of the inland areas where weka, the bush hen, was hunted and processed, and where so much intergroup fighting and intermarriage took place. Warfare, as with our contemporary rugby, netball and politics, had its season. It's probably fair to say that, as in the Super Rugby competition, Canterbury tended to dominate most set play. That's the area where the red line, the blue line and the yellow line are all coming together. But it didn't, as most recently in respect of the Waratahs, always have its own way. From time to time, our more northerly relations, that's the people of Canterbury, indulged in their own internal orgies of self-destruction. One such event, the Kaihuaka feud, so named because close kin were killed and eaten in the early 19th century, left this whole region on the eastern side of the island exhausted and open to the raiding of the musket-armed North Island Ngāti Toa and their Māori and Pākehā allies. The slaughter of the musketless Ngāi Tahu from Kaikoura, that's the area north of Christchurch on the eastern side, from Kaikoura to Akaroa by Christchurch, the slaughter was massive. Ngāi Tahu's Upoko Ariki, or paramount chief, was captured and most cruelly murdered by the invaders. Death and destruction abounded. This new violence, though, was different. It was intrusive. It was the aggression from outside. It was not the ordinary business of interkin feuding, conducted on a proper seasonal basis with a wedding at the end of it. This was massive slaughter. But most kin groups, in most kin groups, external aggression or threat unites all the most discordant households. You've only got to get, I can remember happened in our own family when one of our children was criticised externally, watching Lady O'Regan go into become like an enraged mother duck to protect. Take it out of her later, but while the forces were outside against the house and the family, then the family unites. So too with tribes. And so too with the 1830s Ngāi Tahu. The southern lot, my lot, right down in the very far south, from around what is now Dunedin and Southland, we'd been developing extensive trading relationships with Sydney and Hobart. They were well equipped and military competent. These musket-armed southern Ngāi Tahu, with their modern whaleboats and cannon, their supply lines stocked with the newly adopted potatoes and farm meat, had clear lines of battle-ready and experienced leadership. They rapidly overcame their familial discontents and tribal discords and rallied to the cause to defend the realm. And by the mid-1830s, they'd driven the invaders from outside of Ngāi Tahu's traditional territories back to that little area I showed you earlier, the little red zone at the top of the South Island and parts further north. This led quite quickly to a position where the tribe was able to begin its healing reunification, which meant, of course, that it was returning to a more or less normal climate of interregional, intergroup and interpersonal tension. But our southern world had been changed totally by this war. Muskets, whaleboats, war had changed everything. So too had the dramatically exploding phenomenon of literacy. The kinship remained, but the institution and structures of tribal and sub-tribal authority, the alliances and relationships built up over a couple of centuries of shared experience, they were shattered. Our people's identity, woven in that kinship mesh that I referred to before, that whole net of intermarriage, survived. And related to it, the very closely connected culture of makakakai, or customary food gathering. All this was helped to hold them together, reinforced their bonds, but their world was operationally smashed. And while this base unity of kinship was there, it had lost its form and structure and, importantly, its authority. At the very time Ngāi Tahu needed new and visionary leadership to steer them into the new global economy and political culture, which was surging tsunami-like over them, largely from Sydney and Hobart. Got a lot to answer for. That whole phenomenon of a global culture surging in on top of our people, they were lying there freed from all their traditional restraints of chiefly marriage, relationships and authority. And they're constrained by the new circumstance from cohering into a new unity to meet this whole global challenge that was upon them. There was sufficient coherence to allow for the transactions with the Crown following the Treaty of Waitangi of 1840. Between 1848 and 1863, the whole of the Ngāi Tahu territory, that's except for that little V at the top of the island that you can see there on the map, was transferred to the Crown, subject to various reserves and other requirements in the contracts. Within short order, however, it became clear that the Crown, rapidly, by this time ceasing to be in London and turning itself into a settler state, the Crown was failing to honour its agreements and its contracts with regard both to land reserves and the food gathering options, the mahinga kai, which I referred to. And from that point, in 1849, the long battle for the Ngāi Tahu claims began. Ngāi Tahu now had a new external enemy, a new threat from a common foe. A fresh and emergent basis for unity had been found for the tribe. It was called the New Zealand State. The history of that struggle, in which I was to engage in the 1970s, of the struggle to amend the Waitangi Tribunal legislation and the subsequent marathon hearings and Ngāi Tahu report, of the further 8 years of litigation, some of it at the Privy Council in London, of the negotiation and final agreement, that's another whole chapter of the Ngāi Tahu saga. Suffice to say that when the Ngāi Tahu Claim Settlement Act was finally passed into law in 1998, the struggle with the Crown had absorbed some 7 generations of Ngāi Tahu. The language of the debate was changing. Our history had become much less contested. Our position had been largely confirmed by tribunals, judges and Parliament. The gatekeepers of the power culture had conceded. All the noise surrounding that debate is now reduced. The concern now of academic historians and, of course, as you'd expect, a few obsessively hostile bloggers, is done. I shall refer to it and stand it to one side because I want to talk about its effects. For my mother's generation and those before her, being Ngāi Tahu was synonymous with te kereme, the claim. The claim had become, by the time I came along, the claim had become our culture. All the things that are today seen as culturally iconic in the Māori world, the tangi, our funerals, our gatherings, our hui, the arts, the language, they were ordinary, normal parts of everyday life. The thing that made my mother's people distinctive, that made them Ngāi Tahu, the thing that made them different from other Māori in their own view of themselves, that bound them into their whole sense of tribal being, was their shared consciousness of dispossession and grievance against the Crown. Over the course of that long struggle, our identity as a people had become rooted in grievance, in a sense of collective loss. When one's identity is rooted in grievance, it's difficult to conceive of a future which is not resistant, not characterised by its defiance of the oppressor, not marked by what the poet Roy Campbell described as, I quote, the timeless, surly patience of the serf. What was there in that old heritage that could fire a transformation to a notion of the future, to a new way of being as a people, an identity fueled by optimism and aspiration, not just the removal of misery, but how do you go forward, not just get rid of your grumps. How do you achieve a sense of cultural growth and well-being? In the 150 years of the claim, from 1849 to 1998, Ngāi Tahu had endured, like other iwi, other tribes, all the grinding misery imposed by colonisation. Their legal personality as a people have been deliberately vaporised by the settler parliament. They've been decimated by disease and poverty, deprived of their capital base in land and fisheries, and had no means to take up the opportunities presented by the new global economy. And that global economy now surrounded them. In the south of New Zealand, they had absorbed the full initial impact of settler colonisation per se. It was much later and slower in its impact on the northern tribes. What's extraordinary about that 150 years is that this disparate grouping of far-flung communities that I've described, scattered around the coasts of Tuaiponamu. What's remarkable is it was able to maintain, let alone grow, any sense of tribal community at all. All the forces of demography, geography, New Zealand history were in numerous ways conspiring against any survival of that identity. Yet it did persist, and it continues to persist, despite the regular pronouncements of that assorted accumulation of line umpires and commentators who think it shouldn't, who suggest that the very concept of the tribe is at once both archaic and anarchic, that it has no place in this new millennium of liberal democracy. And the point is, it doesn't just persist. It flourishes today in ways my own generation, let alone my mother's, could not have dreamt of. Ngāi Tahu is now the third largest of all Māori iwi, or tribal nations. The 51,000 individual New Zealanders and Australians, I might add, who identify as Ngāi Tahu, 2 or 3 of them here tonight, clearly wish to continue doing just that. What is it, though, that moves them to maintain that distinctive element in their identity, to pursue their historic and cultural heritage, to maintain their connection? Despite our new substantial tribal wealth and assets, of which more later, no more than a handful of them will ever gain employment within our economic structure. Probably no more than, say, 2,000 of them would be actively in communion with our marae communities, feeding visitors, fixing burial grounds, painting fences, or attending tangi or funerals. Even if we take that number out, another couple of thousand or so to include the more casual participants in our wider culture, then another few thousand to cover those connected by education, scholarships and support. The enrolled tribal membership vastly exceeds the number of those actively involved in tribal life and affairs. But there's evidence aplenty for this great, massive, passive membership having a high degree of adhesion to their Ngāi Tahu identity, and they make lots of assertions to this effect. Minus the adhesive grievance of past generations, which I've referred to, that sense of collective identity just seems to want to keep on keeping on. Why? Let's look at the context. New Zealand itself is a mere minnow in an ocean of global economics and culture. It survives as a distinct cultural and economic identity by dint of geographic isolation combined with global and economic irrelevance. Is that the answer to my question of Ngāi Tahu and their adhesion to identity? Do Ngāi Tahu people continue to identify as Ngāi Tahu because they're able to do so? They threaten no one cares if they do or don't, and they're like New Zealand, freed by dint of irrelevance. But Ngāi Tahu is not just a minority within a larger ethnic Māori minority, it's also southern. It's rooted within Tuaiponamu, the South Island of New Zealand. As people of the Northern Territory, you may have some sense of the geographic and political irrelevance to which I refer. But a sense of geographic and numerical disadvantage is not enough to explain how a distinctive minority identity, such as that of Ngāi Tahu, persists through generations, even when the circumstances giving rise to it are virtually reversed, because reversed they have been. Peace is now broken out, relatively speaking. The Crown and local government now increasingly talk of partnering with our tribal structures on everything from marine reserves to the Christchurch rebuild. We are now consulted on place names, water conservation orders, irrigation projects, all manners of regional plans and schemes. Our traditional marae facilities routinely host gatherings at the request of both local and regional government. And many marae visits by schools have grown exponentially as Māori studies becomes increasingly normalised in the New Zealand school curriculum. And we are now relatively wealthy. We have net assets of close to $1 billion and rising. with a tribally managed superannuation scheme of more than 19,000 members and $35.3 million of funds under management. We are a significant force in the tourism, fishing and farming industries. We are major property developers and investors. We own a number of major government properties within our traditional Southern Territory, which are leased back to the Crown on commercial terms. Since our settlements in 1998, we have distributed approximately $300 million of funds back into our tribal structure, communities and individuals. I'll speak more to this structure a little later, but it's quite a sophisticated, complex corporate and distributional structure. Some would say far too corporate, but that's another matter. All of this is widely seen to be very successful and very worthy, and there's a substantial level of self-satisfaction permeating the Ngāi Tahu community in respect of it. That self-satisfaction, however, is not unvarnished. There remains amongst the wider leadership a sufficient comprehension of reality to understand that there are huge tasks still before us in fully establishing that new foundation, a new base for the reborn Ngāi Tahu nation. Indeed, some of these challenges are quite demanding. How do you insulate your cultural and historical knowledge base from the power culture surrounding you? How do you create your own search engines, your own archives, commission your own histories, your own analyses? How do you take command as a people of your own heritage and identity and insulate it from all the gatekeepers of the arts councils, the libraries and academia, the lottery boards, and all the other caring agencies? All these people and organisations by whom we are surrounded are not bad people. They're not malevolent. Some of them know more about us than we know about ourselves. Some of them care more about our history than do many of our own. But command of your own culture and heritage and being the primary proprietors of your own history is the first priority of cultural autonomy. And actually owning who you are. How do you develop within this nation the intellectual infrastructure to nourish that identity you say you want to hold? How do you build and maintain this tabernacle of the new Ngāi Tahu covenant as the focal point and primary resource of that identity? More important, perhaps, is the question that follows. Just how do you establish processes within that disparate and dispersed 51,000 individuals which allows them access to the underpinning knowledge base of this identity? How best do you assist them to the recovery of their ancestral reo, their language, their waiata, their chant poetry, their kōrero pūrākau, their traditional histories? How do you ensure their access to the tribal story of Ngāi Tahu's culture contact history of the 19th and 20th centuries? Indeed, to the extraordinary history of the Ngāi Tahu claims and their resolution, which I've been personally involved. We're having enough difficulty just getting that straight. I'm not dead yet. How do you enliven their attention to the tasks yet to be undertaken in the areas of customary rights, in the forests and on the coasts and in the rivers? Especially when they all eat more baked beans than they do traditional kai. Yet they all say these things are important. They all say these things are at the forefront of their values. But there's still a very tiny minority who actually really practice those values and those skills and maintain and cherish that knowledge. I've asked a lot of questions. Rest assured, I don't propose to bore you with attempting all the answers. We have a solid group of young, culturally competent professionals wrestling with those questions. I'm also happy to report that those charged with the business of tribal governance are slowly themselves becoming seized of those questions. And this is important because they are the people who are ultimately responsible for the assets of our people, the distributions arising from them. One's political leadership doesn't need to have all the answers, but it's quite important that they understand what the questions are. And I think that's beginning to occur. There is, of course, a big need for social expenditure generated off the back of the recapitalisation I've referred to. There are a whole range of social objectives in health, education and various other good works, subsidising the benefits of citizenship to which we as individual taxpayers are as entitled, I might add, as anyone else. There is a need, too, for ongoing expenditure in defending the realm, the constant and ongoing struggle with the state in its various forms, even just enforcing the agreements so recently and solemnly entered into. We've already learned something about the cost of defending the peace, and we also know that the settler state has a lobotomy every 3 years in New Zealand. And we've got the memory, and it's got very little of it. And so there is just maintaining the peace is a significant challenge and cost. Assuming then that all these purposes are suitably and adequately provided for, I turn to the sustaining of that heritage and identity. How is it best and most appropriately funded? As a consequence of that overriding intergenerational purpose, the capital assets are typically not for sale, but many are themselves seen as intergenerational cultural assets. For various cultural and historic reasons, they are in addition generally weighted towards land and natural resources, particularly fisheries quota, and to the primary sector. Within the Maori frame, the first question is typically not ko waikwe, what is your name, it's no hekwe, where are you from? Geography and place are central to identity. The word for the umbilicus is whenua. It is also the word for land. Place, then, is an important marker of who you are in tribal and cultural terms. My point is that this intergenerational capital supporting an intergenerational heritage is not just seen as a cash generator funding arts festivals and scholarships. Just how the wealth is generated should be congruent to some degree at least with the purpose for which it serves. It should be intergenerational asset base. Travelling a highway past tribally owned lands and forests or taking food fresh from your own coast can be as much a cultural imperative as knowing the meaning of your own place names and speaking Māori. The word I use in my opening greetings to the Larakia people, mana whenua, authority over place, is a concept which ultimately requires a significant measure of actual proprietorship over assets which are themselves part of an intergenerational culture. It helps as well, that's as distinct from just funding festivals and culture and scholarships. You've got to be into the real nitty-gritty of actual proprietorship. It helps as well that land and natural resources are also usefully important vehicles for containing and holding capital on an intergenerational basis. Ask Warren Buffett, or the Harvard University Endowment Fund, which owns most of New Zealand's forests today. For the moment, though, I only note that while we are doing increasingly well in advancing the maintenance of our heritage and identity in our new spending, it is not yet much reflected in how we invest long-term to underpin the future of that spending. And I might notice the Cherokee are having the same argument. And so are the Potawatomi and the Micmac. A considerable proportion of Maori collective capital is in Maori incorporations and trusts, in which shareholdings are privately held. Their purpose and consequently their governance is little difference in structure and requirements from the corporately owned assets in the wider economy. Their ownership is in kin-based Maori entities, but the only thing that is structurally distinctive about them is the Maoriness of their ownership. Their aim is private benefit. Their governance ethic is essentially that of the surrounding economic culture. The governance ethic which I'm referring to, which I'm concerned about, and I referred to at the beginning of this address, relates to a quite different economic and cultural entity. It is that of the collectively owned economic enterprises owned by tribal or iwi collectives, These Maori enterprises are not held in individual private share ownership. They are owned and governed by Maori tribes and, of course, sub-tribal entities. And these asset bases, these units you see beneath, particularly underneath the ones in orange, black, through to the blue-green colour there, they are all company assets held by a holding corporation in green, which is essentially, they're just a bunch of ordinary corporate assets. There's nothing distinguishes them from those in the private general economy, except the way they're owned and what the earnings from them go to. And the assets that they hold are, to a greater or lesser degree, heritage assets. Now, greater, the farmlands are greater. The forest lands are greater. But together with another tribe, we just bought a national bus company. And I would hope that as soon as they can get a margin out of it, they sell it again. So the behaviour of this group over here is not entirely congruent or consistent with the other side of the structure as yet. And that's a part of the struggle that we're dealing with, and that a number of tribes which are now capital rich and cash rich are struggling to bring what's the relationship of this capital to their culture. There's a large group of Alaskan people who are major owners in aircraft maintenance business in the United States, and these Alaskan Inuit own companies which are some of the biggest enterprises in contract aircraft maintenance, and one of their contracts is looking after the President's US-1, the President's big jet and that whole fleet. They do that sort of stuff. It's 1,000 miles away from the people who own it, not just geographically but in cultural and other terms, but it's an asset that drives cash back to them. And they're debating these questions as to the relevance of it. The Seminole in Florida, who are born as millionaires at birth, own the bulk of or the largest gambling enterprises now in Europe, not just in Florida, right? Their biggest investment is in drug and alcohol rehabilitation units. They've got massive wealth, but what for? Even their alligator wrestling that they've taken up, not much good to them, because they've got these great big Burmese pythons that are now inhabiting the whole area and eating the alligators. You know, what for? Although these tribal-owned businesses may swim in the same pool and compete in similar markets to comparable business in the general economy, they're of a fundamentally different character to other enterprises in that economy. That essential difference lies in the intergenerational purpose for which they are owned and the intergenerational character of their ownership. The singular differentiating characteristic and the one that makes it different from individually owned Maori enterprise is that it has a shareholder who never dies. The tribe never dies. On the other hand, general democratic capitalism may be said to be premised on the notion of shareholder death. Now, I don't want you to all wring your hands in despair at this, it's a natural process. Democratic capitalism, however, has a second promise beyond shareholders who die. This is that assets will be sold, broken up, subdivided, regrouped, rearranged at least once, often much more frequently in every generation. It's called the market. This continuous breaking up and redistribution of capital, which is the hallmark of democratic capitalism, is the very opposite of the maintenance of capital on an intergenerational basis. Yet such a basis is the only possible way in which an iwi can ensure that it's going to be able to provide for that heritage and identity on an intergenerational basis into the future. And if it's going to have an economically autonomous entity into the next 30, 40, 50 years, it's got to think very, very differently from the entities, the economic entities that it's living amongst and which is swimming in the same pool as, but it's got to have a different purpose and a different concept, and it's got to be driven by different rules. I note that an iwi economy, or tribal economy, cannot ignore the market. Neither should it. In our world, it will always be surrounded by it, and to some extent it must participate in it to pay the grocery bill for all its day-to-day cash requirements. However, being surrounded by it and having a limited participation in it is one thing. Being a fully paid-up, subscribing and committed member is entirely another, which brings me back to the bus company. This is so because the basic task is different and distinct from the economy it sits within. This multi-generational time horizon and a fundamentally different requirement from its capital make it different. It must produce wealth over the long term, and not just for the generation in which it finds itself. In the case of Ngāi Tahu, for instance, it has essentially guaranteed some of its infant members born this week that their tribally supplemented Whairaua Savings Superannuation Scheme will be there for them when they arrive at age 55. It can't securely promise that on the basis of exposure to the turbulent waters of a constantly shifting market. Bus company gets a flat tyre. When the tribe takes the decision that it actually wants to exist as a culturally identifiable kinship or whakapapa-linked community in a context of its own traditional territory in 2 or 3 generations' time, it has to take decisions now as to how it's going to fund, protect and develop that culture over time. It is that underlying strategic requirement that must inform its economic governance. Now, most of the prescriptions for economic and administrative governance have been evolved within the framework and ethic of Western capitalism, humanised to some degree by a range of variants of liberal democracy. There exists an international government and business subculture of line umpires and regulators and controllers and analysts who make a very good living analysing the achievements of others. Their adjuncts are think tanks and university business schools and MBA programs. I know because I teach in them. From time to time, the whole economic structure stumbles, stalls, gathers itself, stumbles on, generally following some taxpayer-funded intervention. It all works well enough for a market-based system made up of continuous cycles of buying and selling, trading and short-term investing. It accommodates failure, losses and collapse and stumbles on. It is driven, though, by an ethic which has never been able to accommodate a notion of intergenerational capital maintenance. Without indulging myself in that whole subtext presented by inflation, I hope I've said enough to make plain my view that the norms of governance one encounters at seminars on governance verge on the irrelevant in the context of such a concept as a tribally based intergenerational economy. To return to the problem, the primary requirement in formulating this more suitable paradigm of Indigenous governance is a sense of purpose, a clear notion of what and how the group wants to be. Formulating and articulating such a sense is the necessary prerequisite to any developed strategic direction. In the case of Ngāi Tahu, we spent 6 or 7 generations persisting with a sense of identity built around a grievance, as I've earlier recounted. We have historically persisted in our identity as a tribal nation, and that made it possible for us to overcome the grievance, or at least set it aside. We could not have done that unless our forebears actually wanted their world and that of their mokopuna, their descendants, to be different. In their time, though, they had no articulated vision beyond the end of the war. The achieving justice in Te Keremi was their horizon. the claim. All they left us is the clear demonstration that survival is possible. But what for? What kind of survival? Some years ago now, our tribal structure faced that question in an attempt to give itself focus and strategic direction. It produced and promulgated a document called Ngāi Tahu 2025. That document has now reached its half-life. The document was well meant and carefully considered. It contains some very fine aspiration together with 5-year and 25-year targets. It was put to an annual hui atou of the tribe in 2000. There was huge enthusiasm. All formal decisions by the governing body since that time have been required to carry a signed assurance that the decision is consistent with Ngāi Tahu 2025. We describe this document on our website as our tribal map that in the year 2025 will have carried us to the place we are empowered to realise, in which to realise our dreams. The difficulty is that maps don't carry you anywhere. At best, all they can do is assist with directions. I can only observe that the aspirations remain intact at the halfway mark, but I remain deeply sceptical they can be achieved on the basis of present settings. Today we own less tribal land than we did following settlement in 1998. We rent out to others the bulk of our fisheries quota, however profitably, and our Māori language revitalisation effort, although staunchly persistent, cannot be said yet to be winning. To be fair though, we are vastly wealthier and making some great strides in a variety of worthwhile operational and commercial directions. We are doing some things, especially on the cultural and heritage side, better than we ever envisaged in drafting 2025, that map I referred to. And again, to be fair, we have endured in our heartland one of the world's most destructive recent earthquakes, and that has been hugely preoccupying, as well as at the same time providing unique economic opportunity. Thus, we can look at ourselves and say we have a heritage of persistence which we want to transform with a new sense of direction, and we have dreamt and articulated that direction. We have collectively concluded that we want to continue to be, and we have some notion of how we want to be, or say we want to be. We have established the foundations of that intergenerational self-concept of which I've been speaking, and we have adopted a horizon for its achievement. But just as maps are only a guide to direction, horizons of their very nature recede as you move towards them. We still have a substantial disconnect between this intergenerational dream of a Ngāi Tahu heritage and identity and the economic structure we've established to fund it. That structure, our Ngāi Tahu Holdings Corporation, that's the green block on your right, it's got very good directors and management. They're all selected by very tidy conventional governance processes. Its standing in the surrounding economy and its reputation amongst the denizens of those surroundings is one of good repute, and we are collectively happy to receive all their approval of the business media and officialdom. We constructed, though, during my time at the helm of our diminutive nation, a high level of separation between our commercial arm and our political arm. And that separation, the political arms across there in blue, the green and the coloured ones on your right are the commercial arm. They're quite clearly separate. And what we were trying to do, the management convention of the period was to, in the early 90s, late 80s, was to depoliticise the commercial function. We took it all very much to heart. We created a structural ethic of separation very successfully, so successfully that as owners, we now have difficulty in placing any constraints or giving any direction to that right-hand side of the screen, to those people who are charged with wealth generation on our behalf. This is not necessarily the fault of the directors. Our own political representative structure has absorbed this ethic of separation. It sends letters of expectation to its commercial directors on an annual basis, but refrains from imposing its wider policy aspirations on them. To some extent, that reflects a quite understandable willingness to have to grapple with big visionary questions. That requires a level of intellectual commitment that few politicians of any kind manifest. Far easier to deal with minutiae and say no to proposals. That's just ordinary political sloth. And we've got loads of it. We've got it in abundance with our fellow citizens and our political systems. This quite normal form of sloth that I describe avoids debating the form and implication of long-term intergenerational strategy, in case it might find itself wanting to impose it and then be confronted with tensions, difficulty, discomfort. I personally suspect the directors might welcome a more clearly articulated long-term economic strategy with some expression of preference for areas of activity and investments. I'm sure they would welcome debate on the merits of alternative strategies. For the moment, however, there's an amiable relationship but an intellectual distance between these two key elements in our structure, just as I've noticed in Alaska, just as I've seen in British Columbia. And that distance has already resulted in the diminution of our land footprint and our fisheries involvement, notwithstanding this enormous enhanced wealth. We haven't done badly, from 170 million to $1 billion in net asset worth, and spending and circulating 300 million en route since 1998. It's not bad going. It's quite impressive. We're all very pleased with ourselves. But what for? I have given more than sufficient indication then that I believe an intergenerational aim requires an intergenerationally aligned economy. Such an economy requires an aligned form of governance, and that is not to be found in the churn of Western market economics and its conventions of governance. Indigenous economies funding their own future require governance designed to manage and contain assets in the very long term. This paradigm is a work in progress, and its most fundamental requirement is that we are clear, iwi by iwi, tribe by tribe, nation by nation, of what and how we want to be. To the extent I have this evening reported on Ngāi Tahu, I can say that along with other Indigenous communities, we are still some distance from the political, cultural and economic alignment that such governance requires. There are just a few other considerations that should be referred to. All federally organised groupings, and especially those with a high degree of geographical separation, such as Ngāi Tahu, are subject to a constant pressure to desegregate, be they national rugby unions, automobile associations or tribal groupings seeking greater autonomy for their constituent parts. There's always this pressure to desegregate. There is a constant process akin to oscillation, shifting from regional to centralised control or influence. Keeping the scrum together is relatively easy when the group is under external threat, that I referred to earlier. In times of peace or relative prosperity, it is more difficult. Constant political attention will be required of Indigenous groupings to maintain their cultural and kin-based cohesion as their relative economic position improves. One of the key ways to ensure such unity is to avoid an over-centralisation of wealth, which renders the constituents mere recipients of privatised welfare. Dependency on one's own centre is still dependency, and all dependency is ultimately resented. There is no glue like the glue of equity. An active strategy of shared or joint economic enterprise between centre and region, with a strong sense of mutuality of benefit, might go a long way to minimising anyhow, the tendency to desegregate. As well, a strategically informed policy of investment spread across all the regions will counteract desegregation and reduce the risk of parochial resentment. This may well be counterintuitive to the commercial rationale of the tribe's investment advisors, who might criticise such a policy as political. However, if the alternative is a possible political breakup of the shareholders and its assets by desegregation, the need for an active strategy of alignment, of which I spoke earlier, would need to be emphatically presented. Is this not the history of the United States? Australia did it in 1901. How long will it last? What real reason have you got to believe that the political entities that exist now, that we know now, will be there in our grandchildren's time as political entities? Have a think back to what was there when you were young, when you were a youth. What was the division of the world? Why should the existing structures be retained? It'll be interesting to see what Scotland does. But I gather the trains will still run from London to Edinburgh, but they might run through a different structure. There is very little permanent in these things. And our tribes, particularly the far-flung ones, are a little different. They've got the same kind of pressure, and particularly as assets build at the centre, then the bits on the edges feel they're left out and they want to take it. And so you've got to have an active part of your policy of governance designed to reinforce the unity rather than the natural tendency to come apart. That's if you want to be as a people. But you've got to design it in. It doesn't matter about these big crowds, the governments that we have, because they just fall over, but someone else stands up and they'll start taxing again. We don't have the power of tax. Their governance basically doesn't matter. They can have a huge scrap, they can all shoot each other, do all sorts of stuff, but as soon as there's a recognised state, it just has to start taxing again. We don't have that power. We've got to design a model which funds our own identity over time. It's a very different challenge. Then there is the huge impact of demographic change. By the mid-century, the Maori and Pacific Island community in New Zealand will be third in the queue behind Pākehā, New Zealanders of European descent, and Asian, people of Asian descent. The Pākehā will be ageing rapidly, and the core taxpayers supporting them will be largely of non-European descent. The society will be dramatically more culturally and ethnically diverse. The youngest in our family, a great-granddaughter, which makes that lady sitting in front of me a great-grandmother, which she hates me doing, but I think it should be a mark of pride. That great-granddaughter will be 38. Her adult world will be infinitely more complex in a cultural sense than ours has been. At that mid-century, there will be close to twice as many New Zealanders as there are today. What does that mean for Ngāi Tahu as a minority within a minority within a minority? What will be the political status of our settlement contracts with the Crown, of the Crown apology based upon the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi? Will those things still matter? Do we formulate a strategic policy for our wider relationships beyond other Māori, beyond the Crown, with a wider world? On this last query, it's worth remembering that our own Ngāi Tahu relationships with Poihākena, our word for Sydney, Port Jackson, and China were fundamental to our ability to repel those northern invaders in the 19th century. Is that precedent enough for a more independent future? Is that where we're heading? We're already participating in trade missions to China and Japan and sending our own delegations to communities in other countries, on our own as Ngāi Tahu, with other Māori, and sometimes as a sort of haka team decorating government missions. What might this future duality of citizenship look like? New Zealand citizens participating fully in the life of the nation and citizens of the Ngāi Tahu nation at the same time, maintaining a distinct identity within a broader ethnic minority? I'm comfortable enough with that duality, but will our successors be? All the foregoing, though, begs the larger question. There's a question posed by our past experience that I've been recounting. it is inevitable that our successors will find themselves in a comparable situation to that in which we found ourselves following the historic settlements of my generation. In 2025, in 2050, and 2075, they will find themselves in a changed and different context. The demographic frame in which they exist will have changed. Our traditional tribal culture will have further evolved. Indeed, the majority culture surrounding them will be as different as in our own case from the world of parents and grandparents. A quite different view of all that heritage and identity may then exist. Just as we found ourselves searching for ways to transform our concept of ourselves as a tribal nation, different from that which we'd inherited, so might they. Our prescription for the future will by then be the past. We will be ourselves mere footnotes in their history. Archival artefacts, framed photos on a meeting house wall, will they still want to identify as Ngāi Tahu at that time? To exist as a tribal people? Will they still cleave to their Ngāi Tahu identity and the heritage it carries? Now, with reasonable attention to their financial accounts in the interim, however, our successors will be able to address those issues from even better fortified positions. I trust that those positions will have been more strategically selected than ours were. We had no choice but to fight from where we found ourselves. But we, in our time, have gifted our successors with a power of choice, a power denied to our own ancestors. At the very least, they should be able to wrestle with the challenges of their future, unworried about a potential shortage of muskets. I've raised numerous questions with you this evening, and I've answered very few with any certainty. I'm consoled a little by my awareness that many of those questions are being wrestled with, as I've told you, by Indigenous minority communities around the world. From the perspective of what are generally described as one's autumn years, it is comforting to know that we're not the only ones wondering as to whether or not our generation has been wasting its time. Aristotle's injunction, "First know thyself," seems to have some resonance, but it remains still just a preliminary prescription. It is, though, a useful point from which the conversation I propose might be advanced. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Go back to your colour. I think that's a fair observation, if I follow you correctly. But the wider society assumes a whole lot of its cultural character is just there. It's there in its structure, it's there in its arts and its sense of identity. It just exists, and so it doesn't spend any time really focusing on itself as a culture. Whereas the minority is conscious of this, not just, most people live in the wider world in one corner of the national curriculum, if I could call it, the cultural curriculum. The Indigenous minority has to have its whole culture in one corner. It's greatly relieved that I can't sing, but my own people go to great trouble to make sure that if I'm out in public that they're with me, as a rule, so that I will not shame them by the duty of obligation to put a waiata song on the back of my speech, because they get hugely embarrassed by my singing. I'm one of those people who gets asked to refrain from singing and joining in the hymns in church because it disturbs the prayerful intent of the others. And it's that, but a minority culture has a particular challenge about thinking and identifying what it wants to be, because it is surrounded by macro cultures which press in on it and which basically limit its ability to articulate and to be. And people feel torn. Now, I've got an answer to that. You should never feel divided by mixed descent. You should feel that you are not a division sum. The opposite of division is multiplication. You have your cultural potential enhanced, enlarged. And so too with the minority, who've got to be able to function in the wider society around them. They've got something over and above in terms of their cultural potential and expectation to grasp and to grow with. As long as you see this as not, these things not fighting each other, but you see them as additions, you are enlarged by your minority status. So much of this comes from a cultural confidence. And it's a very important thing for a minority, probably more important than people who belong in a dominant culture, who actually believe they're the norm. They think they're ordinary, they think they're normal, and it's the minority that's exotic. So that's the particular challenge that minorities have. And whilst it might have lessons for a wider society, the problem is essential to their survival, not to the wider society. I hope that's a helpful response, and I've already offended against the injunction of brevity. The difficulty is really quite a noticeable one. It's quite important. When we were establishing it, we developed that level of separation I referred to. We were following the management conventions of the time, and we were pretty pleased with ourselves. What's proven to be a difficulty in the long run is that we develop an enterprise and we say it's going to do a whole lot of useful social effects. And one of those is going to provide a whole lot of people with employment who did not have employment before. And they're all feeling good about it, and they're all participants and everything. And then you run into your first seasonal downturn. And the question is, who do you lay off? And how? And you've got a very intense political problem on your hands quite quickly. Internally, and particularly, and I was always very proud on the, one of our companies, Whale Watch Kaikoura, also owns Whale Watch Australia, based out of Gold Coast. And we've developed an international class whale watching tourism, and it's quite a big macro enterprise. And in the early days of that, though, we ran into just this problem. And I was always, had a huge admiration for the kaumātua, the leader of the community that was behind that enterprise in the early days, because he laid all his own family and nieces and nephews off first. And that held the tribe together. But it was grossly unfair to all his nieces and nephews. And there are plenty of people who wouldn't have the political courage and fortitude to do that. And so these things are problematic, and so people feel, the political leaders of the tribe feel a lot more comfortable leaving all that stuff entirely over there and just saying to the enterprises, give us the cash and we'll do our stuff over here. But that ultimately creates privatised welfare. And the communities themselves are not actively engaged in the business of generating wealth themselves. And that's a very challenging thing. You can attack it. You can deal to it if you think that you've got a purpose in challenging that desegregation thing I mentioned. If you've got a structural political purpose, you can get directors to focus on those things, but you're asking directors to do things that directors don't normally do in companies. They don't generally see a social and cultural purpose. Because after all, one of the things you're doing is you're all living off that treaty-based quota that we secured for them. So you're living off culturally based heritage assets. And the directors are getting their fees out of it too. So they've got an obligation to do it, but that's something of a voyage that's yet to be completely achieved. It's not just the bus company, you've got it right down to the fish.
It was very, very interesting. I'm actually glad that I did come along and actually listen in regards to this. I'm currently doing preparation for tertiary success at Charles Darwin University, and being an Indigenous male, I can actually relate a lot of stuff to the things that he was saying, especially culturally related in regards to both ways learning, taking in through other Indigenous knowledge and putting it towards our own can actually help us grow economically and just promote growth internally within clans and Aboriginal groups around Australia. My family's from the Tiwi Islands and all of that, and they are so far away from obviously being where New Zealand's getting themselves at. But they have actually started doing their own businesses, and they've got one in Darwin here where they sell fabrics and paintings and all of that. So it's starting to get to that point, but it's nowhere near the way that was explained today. So at least it's a step forward in the right direction.
I come from Queensland, and my mother comes from the Waka Waka land in Queensland, and at the moment they're going through native title and looking at good governance for my people in Queensland and how we can commercialise on businesses that will benefit our people in the long term. Beginning up a business, you'd like to see good governance across all areas of the business. So you'd like to see that the money goes and all the funds to help the local people and benefit younger generations in your community, not only the present but the future also.
Sorry, Sir Tipene, he made some really good points on things that I think are very important. He referenced what for. I think that we should be doing more as Indigenous people to bring more income back into our own communities. I know small organisations do things like that, arts and things, but there's always a third or a fourth party that also benefits from the income that some of these projects come across, and it would be nice to have something that's just 100% Indigenous owned, or more of a majority of it around our community. So Tipene also referred to things like being of mixed race and how that's important, and that's not something to sort of shy away from. And I think that that was also something that I took on board, being of not just Indigenous, but Indigenous and Polish. So that was something that's encouraging as well to hear him say that. I know that there's a lot of arts programs, there's music programs, things that bring in income into small communities and stuff, but there's not something that's definitely 100% all the income goes and is spread out just to Indigenous communities. There's always some other factor, and I think that with the majority of Indigenous people that we have having degrees and all sorts of professional experience, it wouldn't be that hard to produce these programs and benefit from the income that definitely the arts in Central Australia, that's a big one.
I found it extremely interesting and it was quite inspiring. It's good to see an Indigenous nation that's doing quite well and progressing into the future. Where I'm from, we've got the Southwest Land and Sea Council, and we're slowly progressing towards a level that's quite as formalised as this Ngātaongi group, but we're not quite there yet. We've got a lot to get through. Yeah.
So it's really important to learn from the past and learn from a lot of other Indigenous peoples. And as a teacher, I want this generation to grow up with positive self-identity, cultural identity, and our knowledge is secured.
I support this event because of my Gurindji heritage and in memory of our grandfather, Vincent Lingiari. And I always honour my Gurindji grandmother, so it's my way of remembering her as well. The presenter tonight was really, really good. And probably because I'm being a colonial historian, he talks a lot of my language as well, so and I liked his sense of humour. I think he was really good. So it just goes to prove that academic lectures don't have to be dry and boring, and you can, you know, put little funny bits in there and be entertaining as well.
With the lecture tonight, very inspiring for our own economy, because we've been involved for many years with community development and community control. But that seems to be a very distant thing for Aboriginal people. And when I look at my trophy, you might say, all we have is a torn shirt after all these years. How do we get to that position of economic safety and control? It's been very, very difficult. I listened to the doctor, and he was talking about doing it for your needs. What do you want this economy or this wealth to provide for you? And it has to be for your culture and your survival as a people. And how do you separate that from the fact that you need the economy to survive? I think we can learn from the model, except that I don't know how we can compete with the government, because the government then will go hard and then start decreasing their support for the people. So do we do that? Do we disadvantage our people by trying to do it alone? Or do we develop some memorandum? We don't have a treaty, and we have to start talking now about a treaty and how we can, their famous words is, close the gap.
From little things, big things grow. From little things, big things grow.